Hello again, everyone. Welcome to Washington Gun Law TV. I am Washington Gun Law President William Kirk. Thanks for joining us. We're going to talk about universal background checks today. Now, my experience out here in the People's Republic of Washington is probably a lot different from most of you who live in the United States of America. We closed the gun show loophole, if you would, back in 2009. We've been living under a regime where unless it's your mom, your dad, your sister, your brother, or a couple other family relationships, every other private sale is going through an FFL full background check on the purchaser, as if it was a sale going through the FFL, because it actually is in the state of Washington. Now, those who banter for civilian disarmament, they beat this drum all the time. We need universal background checks. And then when you ask them what exactly does that entail, they can't really tell you. And then there are those in our community who believe that all gun laws are unlawful, and they may be right, actually. I'm not going to get into that with them today, but they will decry universal background checks, and yet they can't even really tell us what they are also. If every single sale in the United States had to go through the exact same process as when you go and purchase a firearm from one of your local FFLs, that would be universal background checks. But did you ever stop and think that the groundwork necessary to force that upon all of us is already in motion? Well, it is. I'm going to show it to you, and I'm going to show you exactly why. So today, let's spend a few minutes and let's talk about how we have all been set up already for universal background checks. Okay, so this is the second topic I've done on this video, but I'm taking a slightly different angle, and this is what's happened sometimes when you have a little more time to think about it and take more of a 35,000 foot view. As we know, your Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms has absolutely been thrilled to issue new rules over the last few years. There was the one on frames and receivers. That went really well for them. There was the one on firearms with attached stabilizing braces. That went really well for them also. And now we get word that the Biden administration has asked the Department of Justice and the ATF to promulgate new rules as it relates to who really is an FFL if you're engaged in the business of selling firearms. And therefore, if you go all the way back to what President Biden said, his 5 deadly sins on how are you going to get yourself in trouble, well, one of the things is selling a firearm without the required FFL licensing requirements. Well, how could he force that upon all of the millions and millions of Americans who lawfully and responsibly purchase and sell firearms privately through various channels and various platforms on a daily basis? Well, the way they can do that is number one, you need to rewrite the law a little bit. Always tricky, and this is where ATF seems to run into the most problems. The law doesn't get rewritten. The ATF just steps in and says, well, we're going to promulgate a bunch of rules and kind of change the meaning of the law, essentially change the law. And of course, they're not acting as an Article 1 branch of government. Therefore, they have no legislative power, and we get into the whole separation of powers issue. So what you actually need is a change in legislation first. And then if you had the change in legislation, could you then use a rule-making order to fit within the new language of that legislation to say, yeah, basically, you know what, if you're selling any number of guns, and you could set the number really low, like, 2 guns a year, 3 guns a year, 1 gun a year. If you're selling it for any type of profit, you are in fact an FFL. And so what that essentially does is it shuts down private sales nationwide, not through state laws, but through federal rulemaking order that is consistent with a new federal statute. That, my friends, is how they could force all of you. And I don't care whether you're in a state as blue as mine or California, or in a state that actually enjoys individual liberties, okay? You could all be forced into this. How does that get done? Well, it works like this. First, you have to amend the definition of what is it to be engaged in the act of being an FFL, okay? Now, that would take a huge step from Congress, but guess what? It already happened. Yeah, that's right. Because let us not forget that the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act was passed with the support of several Republicans. And I will remind everybody that there were many on the right that were screaming, do not give them an inch, they will take a mile. Now, I was not one of those that was screaming out that. I was not speaking in support of the legislation. I was not speaking in opposition. I was kind of standing on the sidelines watching everything happen. But there were several groups, and I will also point out a group that I have been very critical of, the NRA, was actually very vocal in their warning saying, hey, you don't realize that if you give these people a blank check, they're going to use this in the most nefarious ways. Well, they may have actually been right. You see, because as we talked about on this video right here, previously, an individual only needed an FFL when they were engaged in a course of trade or business involving repetitive buying and reselling of firearms with the principal objective of livelihood and profit. So that sounds like somebody who is doing this a lot and their sole source of income or primary source of income. Sounds just like an FFL. But then the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act changed and watered down that definition, because now the Bipartisan Safety Community Act removed the livelihood element so that profit seeking alone would fulfill the required objective of the sales. And so merely sales which are seeking profit now can get you to fall underneath the definition of an FFL. Now, it also requires the requirement of repetitive. Okay, but if you look repetitive up in a dictionary, you realize that it doesn't have to happen too many times in order for it to be deemed repetitive. And so now steps in the ATF's new rulemaking order, because we got a whole new definition of FFL. And are there some gaps in there that the rulemaking order may want to? Well, yeah, it does. And according to the New York Times, now I granted this is not the most reputable publication in the world, so take it for what it is worth. But according to the New York Times, yes, the Biden administration has asked the Department of Justice to move forward with a brand new rulemaking that will basically define every private citizen who is engaged in selling firearms as an FFL, which means the only way that they could actually engage in that type of commerce is to have the FFL, and which means then the only way they can sell those firearms is as they are an FFL. And now, ladies and gentlemen, we have universal background checks nationwide. That is how they do it. But we come back to this whole threshold. How many transactions do you have to engage in a year for it to be repetitive enough that you are now a FFL? Well, according to the New York Times article, the regulations will set a threshold number of transactions that would define a dealer. Gun control groups hope to see at least 5 sales a year or lower. The rule will be backed up by a renewed push to prosecute businesses that refuse to register by accessing bank records, storage unit leases, and other expenses associated with running off-the-books gun businesses. So in addition to forcing universal background checks down everybody's throats, let us also point out that the New York Times says, hey man, they're coming for you. They're going to come to your home. They're going to come to your storage unit. They're going to be raiding your bank records. They're going to be seizing all sorts of records. Yes, this is the Joe Biden 2023 America. Don't believe me? We've talked about this privatization of tyranny, and the New York Times article heavily featured an online purveyor called Arms List. Within hours of the article being published on the New York Times website, guess what? YouTube canceled Arms List page. So the lesson to learn here is this, is that, you know what? Some of those people who sometimes we think are just a little too extreme, but they say no compromise, because if you give them an inch, they will take a mile. Well, you know what? They might be right sometimes, and actually they may be right all the time. The other thing we need to learn is that right now, as we sit with the Bipartisan Safety Communities Act, redefining what it is to be an FFL, and now knowing that the ATF is going to make a rulemaking order that's going to plug in all those little gaps, the bottom line is, America, we may be on the precipice of having universal background checks shoved down every one of our throats. We're going to link up all the articles that we relied on in doing this video so you can geek out on yourself. We're going to very carefully watch this. You know, we very carefully watch ATF rulemaking orders because, one, they have a tendency to resemble the Hindenburg in the last few minutes of their flight, and number two, they are so damn entertaining. Listen, you may have more questions about this or anything else related to what's left of our Second Amendment rights. You guys should know how to contact Washington Gun Law by now, but if you don't, that's okay. That information is right down there in the description box. Now, in the meantime, I want all of you to remember that part of being the lawful and responsible gun owner, like we talk about all the time here, is to know what the law is in every situation and how it applies to you in any instance that you may find yourself. Until next time, thanks for watching and stay safe.